I want to welcome everyone here, those who are in the classroom, those who are joining through Zoom, or those who will be watching at a later point the recorded video. And I'd like to begin with prayer tonight as we begin this study. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, we believe in you. Increase our faith. We trust in you. Strengthen our trust. We love you. Let us love you more and more. We are sorry for our sins. Deepen our sorrow. We worship you as our first beginning, and we long for you as our last end. Lord, enlighten our understanding, strengthen our wills, purify our hearts, and make us holy. We pray and we ask these things in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Let me share slides here with this group online. Okay. So I'm excited that you're here. It seems like every time we do a semester of classes, we always have weird weather. So in the spring, we had an ice storm and stuff. And today we've got Noah's Ark kind of weather. So you just never know what to expect in Oklahoma. But we're going to be going through this in 8 weeks. And those of you who've taken a class with me before are probably thinking there's no way he's going to get through this in 8 weeks. So, but it is my ambition and my goal to get through this in 8 weeks, and I've got it laid out. So we're gonna make it happen. One, we need to because we want to contain it to the summer term and then start something new in the fall semester. So anyway, what we're studying is an apostolic exhortation written by Pope Francis. For those who might be watching who are non-Catholic, because we have a kind of a mixed group, Pope Francis is the current Pope. And so the apostolic exhortation that we're going to be studying is Gaudet et Exsultate. Now that's a mouthful in Latin. So it's easier to say rejoice and be glad. That's what it means. Okay, so that's what we're gonna refer to rather than the Latin and get tongue-tied. But I do want you to be aware that it does have that title in Latin. Now you might be wondering, first of all, well, what is an apostolic exhortation? Because last semester, we studied a papal encyclical. So you might be saying, okay, well, what's the difference between apostolic exhortation written by a pope and a papal encyclical? And so when it comes to the pope exercising his magisterial role, his teaching role, his pastoral role, there are a variety of ways in which the Pope can communicate, teach, inform, and depending on the way that the Pope chooses to do that, there's different levels of authority that are associated with the kind of writing that it is, or the way that the Pope chooses to communicate. And so you just kind of think of this in terms of like there's a hierarchy of levels of authority in the way that the Pope may communicate. So, for example, if the Pope makes a ex cathedra statement, then that obviously is very high authority. It's protected by the Holy Spirit, infallible, unchangeable. Those are rare in the history of the church, but they have occurred. So then if you think about just sort of that ladder and you kind of move down the ladder a little bit, there's what's called apostolic constitutions, and that is a writing that deals with serious, weighty matters of doctrine, and maybe disciplinary matters and so forth. And it's legal, it's legislative. So the Pope is basically, if he's writing an apostolic constitution, then that carries this legal weight within the church. And so it's binding upon us. And then if you go kind of move down the ladder a little bit, then you have encyclicals. And when it comes to encyclicals, these are papal letters. They're usually written with more of a pastoral tone, a shepherding, pastoral kind of nature to them. And they offer counsel, understanding on existing doctrine, so that you can understand it in a deeper way, that you can maybe apply it to today's world, today's time, today's situations, and so forth. And an encyclical also, it carries a high degree of papal authority. Not as high as the previous two, but still it's binding. So last semester we studied Evangelium Vitae by Pope St. John Paul II, and that was an encyclical. So it carries a significant amount of weight when it comes to the teaching of the church. So then if you move down a little bit more down the ladder, you have apostolic exhortations, which is what we're going to be spending our semester on for the summer. An apostolic exhortation is usually a writing where a pope wants to explore and reflect on a particular topic or issue, not in a legislative way. So he's not trying to like impose any kind of, this is a rule, or this is binding upon the church in a legal kind of way. But it really is more of, let's talk about this issue and let's sort of unpack it. Let's apply it to our lives in a very practical kind of way. And so it doesn't carry the same weight as the others, but that doesn't mean that it's insignificant. Okay. It's still the Pope exercising his teaching office. And obviously within the writing, there's going to be scripture, there's going to be sacred tradition and all those authoritative sources and so forth. And so even though it doesn't have the same weight of authority, it doesn't mean it's insignificant. It's just a different type of writing. So we can't spend a lot of time on that. So I just want you to kind of visualize maybe that kind of ladder. So popes communicate in different ways and they have different writings. And I haven't even mentioned all of them because it could get really, kind of crazy to talk about every single kind of papal writing that there is. But these are the major ones that you would encounter. So that being said, our focus tonight is more to, before we study the words of the Pope, we want to learn a little bit more about him. So tonight is a little bit more biographical, and along with some theological understanding of how Pope Francis, his formation, the way he thinks and so forth. And then next week and the following 7 weeks, we'll get into the actual document. And so we'll talk more about that at the end. So that being said, we're going to talk a little bit about Pope Francis. And I thought it would be good to begin with a story. This is a true story and it's told by a journalist, an author by the name of Austin Ivory. And he was having an interview with Pope Francis. And so they bring him in and they set him next to Pope Francis. And there's silence, and Pope Francis is staring this journalist in the eyes, but he's not saying anything. So he's just sort of staring at the guy, and the journalist is kind of, a little bit uncomfortable. Well, finally, Pope Francis breaks his silence, and he says this. He says, I've read a number of things that you've written about me, and I just have one criticism. So the journalist says he's bracing himself for the criticism. He's expecting to get rebuked by the Pope for something that he's written about him. So he braces himself, and then there's this pause again. And then Pope Francis smiles and says, his criticism is this: you're too kind to me. That's not what the journalist was expecting, but obviously he was relieved and charmed. And so the journalist responds and he says, well, I promise that I'll try to be more critical of you in the future. And so both of them laughed about it, and they thought that was funny. And the journalist ends his describing the story with this phrase: the Pope is fun. The Pope is fun. Now, I think that's beautiful, because if you were to ask people to describe the Pope, talk about the Pope, I don't know how many people would think of fun. There might be lots of other things that they would think of, but fun's probably not at the top of the list in most people's minds. And yet here's this journalist who's had this encounter with the Pope and discovers that the Pope has a great sense of humor and laughs and is fun to be around. And I think that is certainly appropriate as we study a document that's called Rejoice and Be Glad, to understand that here is a Pope who does rejoice and is glad and is joyful and those kinds of things. So that I wanted to sort of open with that. And then one other thought that I want to open with, just in Pope Francis's thinking before we get into his biography a little bit. This is what he said in his address from St. Peter's Square in 2013. And I think it's beautifully put. Today's world stands in great need of witnesses, not so much of teachers, but rather of witnesses. It's not so much about speaking, but rather speaking with our whole lives. So think about what he's saying there. He's not saying don't speak, right? He's not saying, don't ever share the gospel. He's not saying don't ever talk about Christ. But what he's saying is there's something more that's needed. What's needed in today's world if we're going to impact the world? What's needed today if we are going to share the gospel? Well, it's not about being the greatest intellectual in the room. It's not about being the most eloquent speaker or teacher. That's not what it's about. What is most needed is people who embody what they believe, who live out what they believe. Another way of putting it is to say that our lives must tell the same story that our lips proclaim. Because that's the reality. If you talk to people who are outside the church, you talk to people who are away from the faith, what's one of their number one complaints about Catholics or Christians? Hypocrites, right? That's what they'll often say. They'll say, you say one thing and you live differently. You say you believe this, but you act like this. And so they see, when they see that that separation between belief and proclamation and how we live, then it turns them off. And they say, this thing's not for real. And they're not attracted to the faith then, because they think it's phony. And so I think that's really getting to the heart of what Pope Francis is saying here, in this idea of what it means to be a witness. So I thought that was good to sort of just begin to try to understand Pope Francis in reference to that he's fun, but he's also about being authentic in our faith, in the way that we live out that faith. All right. So we're going to go through some brief bio stuff. This probably will not be the most stimulating part of the talk, but we'll get into some more significant matters, so bear with me. But there are some facts that probably would be helpful to know that we need to address just in general. So, I'm not going to spend a long time on this. So if you feel like I'm moving too fast and you get flustered, sorry, I've got an hour. So I have less than an hour now. So I gotta go fast. So as far as Jorge Bergoglio, who is now known as Pope Francis, he was born in Buenos Aires on December 17th, 1936. Now, there's not anyone in this room that was alive in 1936. Not even me. Okay? So in case you were confused and you were thinking that perhaps I was around back then, no, I was not alive in 1936 either. He is the son of Italian immigrants to Buenos Aires. Now, I think it's important to note that because one of the issues that you will find Pope Francis very passionate about is immigration. How do we treat immigrants? How do we receive them, and so forth? Well, you could understand not only from the teachings of the social teachings of the church side of things, but you could just understand from life experience on why that would be important, understanding that his parents were immigrants, right? So that sort of helps us understand why certain issues might be important to him. He was raised in a very religious Catholic family, so he was brought up in the faith in a very solid way and a very devoted way. So no issues there. And when he was 17 years old is when he first recognized God's call on his life. And he began to recognize that God was calling him to the priesthood at age 17. Didn't necessarily do anything specific to act upon that, but he did experience that call. Sort of moving ahead a little bit to 1957. He's about 21 years old at that time, and he gets a severe case of pneumonia. Very serious, to the point where they have to remove part of his right lung. That's how bad it was. In that following year, when he would have been 22 years old, or actually that same year, 1957, is when he announced to his parents that he wanted to become a priest. So he felt the call earlier, but he really didn't express that to his parents until he was a bit older, 21. His father was enthusiastic. He was very supportive about his son becoming a priest. His mother was not enthusiastic about that. And so I bring that up. I think that's important because many of you are sort of seeking out your vocation in life, and you may have, and even your faith walk and so forth. And so, some of you may have family members that don't understand. Maybe they're not fully supportive, or they're like, why do you want to do that? Or why are you looking into that? So we can kind of relate to some of those kinds of issues. He had to go through that as well. Now, his mom eventually came around, but in the beginning, she was not too hip on this idea of her son becoming a priest. And there are many a priest who could sort of share a similar experience like that. So in 1958, at age 22, he enters the Society of Jesus. And this begins a period of formal education, instruction, and so forth. He's actually, I think the slide says 21, but he's 22 at this time. And this is the beginning of what's going to be 14 years of instruction and formation 14 years. Now, some of you who have been in college or beyond may feel like it's been 14 years. Or if you haven't, you know, it still may feel like a long time. I've been in school all my life, just about, it seems like. But 14 years is a significant amount of time for, you know, one's formation and so forth. But after his first 2 years, he took the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And so he, you know, he does that after his first 2 years in this process. While in this process, he taught literature and psychology at a Jesuit high school, or several Jesuit high schools in the mid-1960s. He also taught at the college level. And he was ordained a priest in 1969. So again, I know these years are hard for you guys to relate to. We're getting closer to my time period, but we're not quite there yet, okay? So he's about to turn 33 years old, and he's ordained a priest. And then in 1973, I guess I have that on the slides. In 1973 is when he completes his long period of religious formation with the Jesuits. He takes his last vows. So in this process, he renews his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but he makes a fourth vow that is very significant to the Jesuits. And that vow is a vow of obedience to the Holy Father. So it's a very significant part of being a Jesuit. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. So he does that in 1973. I am alive by then, just barely. I was born in 72, okay? So like I said, we're now creeping into my lifespan here. So later on, just some brief things. He does become Archbishop of Buenos Aires in 1998. And then he later becomes a cardinal. And he is appointed cardinal. Anyone know who appoints him cardinal? Any guesses? Yep. John Paul II. It is the one who named him cardinal in 2001. And so again, that's still probably earlier than, when were you guys born? Okay, so we're starting to get into some of your lifespan here then. Okay, all right. And then of course he is elected Pope on March 13th, 2013 at age 76. So that's just some biographical information to kind of orient him in terms of time and some of the process that he went through in terms of his formation and so forth. And we'll talk more about that. Some interesting characteristics, what I think are interesting facts about Pope Francis. One is he is the first Pope of the Americas. Very significant. It took us a while, to get a Pope from the Americas, but we finally have one. He's also the first Jesuit to become a Pope. And we'll talk about the significance of that in just a minute as well. And then he is also the first Pope to take the name Francis. Very significant. So that's why he's not Pope Francis V or something like that. No Pope had taken that name prior to him doing so. He's a very intelligent man, and in terms of languages, he speaks multiple languages, and these aren't all of them, but these are the ones that I know of for sure: Spanish, Italian, Latin, English, French, and German. But I am aware that he has at least some ability in other languages as well. So to be able to handle all of those languages and keep those in your head and be able to navigate between those, to me, requires a great degree of intelligence and ability. He's an early riser. From what I've read and researched about him, he gets up about 4 a.m. So he and I are a little bit alike in that way, because I get up at 4:30 a.m. So he beats me by a little bit in terms of time, but he's probably up later than I am as well. So, but he likes to get up early. That's just part of his practice before he even became a pope, was to get up that early. He does not like to be late. And that's something that I share in common as well. I'm early. If I'm on time, I'm late. I have to be early. So I drive my wife nuts sometimes because she's happy to be there just on the dot. But I'm like, no, we cannot walk in right at the time. It has to be early. So he apparently doesn't like to be late either. He dislikes being addressed by titles. So this is something, again, prior to him even becoming pope. So he doesn't like necessarily he didn't like being addressed as cardinal or your eminence and so forth. He's a very simple man, and he's not caught up in titles and all the things that are associated with that. And we'll see some of that comes out of his formation. And then some of that, I think, is just his humble spirituality as well. He's not really much for pomp and circumstance as well. So he doesn't like flashy, showy kinds of stuff. Again, a very simple man, and we'll see some examples of that. One close friend of his describes him as being organized, careful, and methodical. He doesn't take a step without thinking about it first. So even in those times where it may seem like he's just, flying off the cuff or just saying whatever comes into his mind or something, just be aware of his general, the kind of person that he is. It may appear to be that way, but he's probably given a lot of thought to what he was going to do or say. He's very methodical. There's a reason for why he does the things that he does, even if he doesn't share those reasons. And even if we don't understand what those reasons are at times. So it's just something to keep in mind about him. He's not easily demoralized, which is good when you're the Pope, because that's a tough calling. But he is not very fond of the media. Doesn't like the media too much. He's been quoted as saying that if I give 4 notes to journalists, do, re, mi, fa, he says they might end up composing a wedding march or a funeral march. So he's making a point there. It's like, when it comes to the media, they sort of take what you say or what you do and they spin it. And they portray you in a particular way. And so I think there's probably a growing dissatisfaction with the media because of that very problem. And so he obviously shares that sentiment. And when it comes to the media and Pope Francis, if you follow media at all, you are aware that the media is kind of all over the place when it comes to Pope Francis. Some to the point of championing him as a great hero, and others vilifying him as the worst ever, right? And so you just see that in our world today. This close friend describes him as unpredictable, and he is. You think he's going to do one thing, he does another, and so he surprises people. He has very clear ideas and strong nerves. And because of this, it is said that he has collected some enemies along the way, because, again, he's just very much clear on what he's going to do, what needs to be done, and he's very unpredictable. And So lots of people have negative reactions to that. So that being said, what we want to talk about for the next little bit is a couple of things. I'm just going to kind of give you a preview, and then we'll talk about these things. So we're going to talk about a couple of major areas. We're going to talk about his being a Jesuit and how that formation influences the way that Pope Francis thinks and the way that he approaches issues. And then we're going to talk about his papacy a little bit. We'll talk about his election. We'll talk about some of the things that have been like key things that he emphasizes in his papacy and so forth. We'll also talk briefly about this idea of him being a reformer. And then we'll talk briefly about his ecclesiology, which is a big word that means his understanding of the church, his theology of the church, and how that influences what he understands the church in terms of what the church ought to be doing and how the church ought to be acting and so forth. So that's where we're going for the remainder of our time. And then we will wrap up with some course details that will kind of set the map for the rest of our time together. All right. So everybody still with me? We're still breathing. Let's get into this issue of being a Jesuit. Some of you might be very familiar with the Jesuits, and some of you might be saying, what is a Jesuit? Jesuits are basically a religious order. They're referred to as the Society of Jesus. They were founded by Saint Ignatius of Loyola. And so within the Catholic faith, there are many different religious orders within that fold. So you have Franciscans, you have Dominicans, Benedictines, Jesuits, and the list goes on. And so this is a particular religious order that has its own particular reason for being, if you will. And it goes all the way back to St. Ignatius of Loyola and has a long history within the church. One of the major aspects of the Ignatian spirituality, and the reason it's called Ignatian is because it goes back to St. Ignatius. One of the characteristics of Ignatian spirituality is it encourages reflection, prayer, and discernment in the midst of the constant daily struggle between good and evil. So for any of you who have been volunteers here long enough to be a part of the Retreat in Daily Life program, you practice the spiritual exercises. And so you get a taste of Ignatian spirituality and discernment within that program. But it's very much this idea, reflecting, prayer, discerning, but notice that it's discerning in the midst of daily life. And what are you discerning? Well, you're trying to discern between good and evil. You're trying to discern God's will. So you're praying and you're thinking and you're trying to navigate through life in a way that's in harmony with God, in a way that's in harmony with his will for your life. And so this is the spirituality of Pope Francis that he has been formed by. Here's a statement of his where he is describing the Ignatian vision. He says, the Ignatian vision is the possibility of harmonizing opposites, of inviting to a common table concepts that seem irreconcilable because it brings them to a higher plane where they can find their synthesis. So that puts it pretty well. This Ignatian vision is realizing that on many matters, not all matters, but on many matters, it is possible to harmonize opposite ideas, opposite convictions, opposite beliefs, ideologies, and so forth, that it is possible to bring about a harmony between those two and move forward in a more significant way. And so this is part of the way that Pope Francis thinks. And so when it comes to, a synthesis, what is a synthesis? Well, you take maybe two ideas together, and out of those two ideas, you bring them together and you arrive at a greater truth or a deeper truth, or maybe a greater understanding, or just a way forward navigating those two ideas. So it's very much the goal of this Ignatian vision is unity versus polarization. So our world is very polarized, right? Into different camps, into different groups, different ways of thinking, different beliefs, different convictions, and we're polarized into, and it's not just politics. Politics is one arena where you can see it, but it's in the church. There, you have that, you have this group over here that thinks this way, and this is what the Catholic Church ought to be and what the Catholic Church ought to do. And then you've got this group over here who has a different idea, and so forth. And so this is part of the world that we live in. And so Pope Francis is going to approach things where his goal is to somehow bring unity out of these opposing ways of thinking and being. How can we move forward together instead of remaining separate? Does that make sense? So I think that's a very important idea to understand in terms of his Jesuit formation. And this sort of makes sense on why he is very difficult to categorize and label. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. But he really baffles people sometimes, because as soon as someone labels him one way, he does something and it's like, okay, he doesn't fit that label. So then they label him as something else. Well, he doesn't fit that label. So, part of that, I think, is his trying to navigate and maintain that unity of the church rather than just fragmentation, if you will. So to kind of help us understand Ignatian spirituality a little bit, there is a former Jesuit by the name of Chris Lowney who wrote a book, Pope Francis and Why He Leads the Way That He Leads. And he talking about that Jesuit formation that Pope Francis inherited. And he talks about there's like these 6 principles that Pope Francis has inherited from this Jesuit formation, and these are 6 principles that he sort of uses to lead and to guide as Pope. And it'll help once we talk through them. You'll see what I mean by harmonizing opposites or bringing some sort of balance between extremes. Okay. So the first 2 principles. The principle number 1 is know yourself deeply. And principle number 2 is live to serve others. Know yourself deeply, but live to serve others. Now, what's being harmonized here? Well, it's the inward and the outward. See, there's an extreme. There's some people who just want to look inward all the time, right? They want to think about themselves. They want to work on themselves, and they want to just be contemplative all the time and so forth. And they can become very much, if you're not careful, you go too far to an extreme, you can become self-absorbed by this inward focus. But at the same time, you have to pay attention to yourself, and you have to know yourself, right? Because we all need work. And you can't lead others if you can't lead yourself. You can't help others in their walk with God if you're not walking with God. And so you do have to know yourself deeply, and you do have to spend some time working on yourself, but you don't want to become self-absorbed. And so how do you avoid that? Well, you also live to serve others. So that's the outward focus, that you serve others, you love others, you give your attention to others. And so this pulls you out of yourself and helps you to be present to other people. And that's important. But see, other people will go to the other extreme. They might spend all of their time working to serve others and to care for others, but never spending any time with themselves. So that's, see how that could be another dangerous extreme. So this is where you take these two extremes, focus on yourself and live to serve others, and you bring them together in a harmony where there's some balance. Okay, so those are two of the principles. The next two, immerse yourself in the world, but withdraw from the world daily. Now, see, that seems contradictory. How am I supposed to immerse myself in the world and withdraw from the world daily? And yet, both are important and both are possible if we bring them together in proper balance. So when it comes to this, there are some people who just want to immerse themselves in the world, but they never withdraw and get along with God, right? And then there's those other people that always want to be alone with God in prayer, and they never are involved in the world, right? And so it's this balance again. And the beautiful thing about this is that you see this harmony in the life of Jesus. And for those of you who are following or a part of the Gospel of Life School, we're currently studying the Gospel of Mark. And if you'll remember from Mark chapter 1, there's a section that points out this harmony very beautifully. And it's Jesus living this out. And so what happens is that Jesus goes to the house of Simon and Andrew, and next thing you know, the whole town's bringing people to Jesus. He's up late healing people, casting out demons, performing these miracles and so forth. So he is very much immersed. He's immersed himself in the world of these people. But what does he do right afterwards? Well, in chapter 1, verse 32, verse 35, it says, in the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. So there he's withdrawing to be in communion with the Father and the Spirit in prayer. So you see how Jesus is living out that harmony. And so this is part of that Ignatian kind of formation that has been important for Pope Francis. It's sort of, there's a time to be engaged in the world and there's a time to disengage from the world. And you can do that daily if you are intentional about it. And then finally, the next principle is, the fifth principle is live in the present and revere tradition. And then the sixth principle is create the future. And so the real beauty of this is it's taking past, present, and future and bringing it together in a harmony again, in a synthesis. Because there's some people, right, who live in the past. I'm stuck in the past. Let's live in the good old days. Whatever the good old days were for whoever, they just sort of get stuck somewhere in the past. And they can't move past that point. And they're always trying to get back to that point, right? And then there's some people who are always living in the future. There's something out there. There's something more out there. And they're always chasing something in the future. And they're never present. And they sort of ignore the past. And they're just always pursuing something ahead. And what this understanding is that, okay, there is a very important place for honoring and learning from tradition. But you don't want tradition to keep you from moving forward. And you don't want to use tradition as an excuse to say, I'm afraid of any kind of change. Now, there's appropriate change and there's an inappropriate change. Okay, so you have to discern. But there is this understanding that we don't want to be a people stuck in the past and trying to recreate the past, because we don't live in the past. We live in the present, and we're creating the future now by what we do and how we live, right? And so, the past is guiding us as we move forward in creating that future. All right, so those are 6 principles that kind of would help us understand how Pope Francis would navigate through different issues and sort of how he leads and so forth. He's holding things in balance. And so hopefully that gives you some sense of Jesuit formation. There's a lot more, and I'm not a Jesuit, so I'm not going to claim to be an expert on that. But I think this is enough to sort of orient us to kind of appreciate how Pope Francis thinks and how he reasons and so forth. Now, a close friend, Elisabetta Piquet, actually believes that Pope Francis saved the Society of Jesus. This is her words. She's a close friend. She's also a journalist and so forth. Because according to her, the Society of Jesus had declined and it had become divided. And thanks to Pope Francis, it has begun to experience renewal and growth once again. So she credits him with being a very integral part of that. So that's the Jesuit part. Let's talk a little bit about him becoming Pope. So his name is Jorge Bergoglio, and he was one of the 115 electors of the conclave that had the responsibility to elect a successor to Benedict XVI, because Pope Benedict XVI resigned. So there was a need for a pope. So Jorge Bergoglio is one of the 115 that has that task of selecting the next pope. And he ends up being the one who is elected pope. It was in the 6th round of voting. So they voted and they kept, well, we don't have enough and so forth until they had the enough percentage to declare a clear winner. If you want to say winner, it probably isn't the best term to use there. But the one who got the votes to be elected with this understanding that the Spirit is guiding the church in that choice. And like I said, he's the first Jesuit to become Pope. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And this is where some people wrestle with this a little bit when it comes to Pope Francis. And I gotta keep an eye on my time, and it's going fast. So the Jesuit rule book and its constitutions, it is very much against excessive personal ambition. It decries it as the mother of all evils in any community or congregation. So Jesuits promise to God that they will never seek a high office in the church. So they really make this pledge to say, okay, I'm not going to seek out a high office in the church. I'm not going to be consumed with this excessive personal ambition. And so you can see where this would cause some people to say, okay, well, if that's part of being a Jesuit, then how does Pope Francis, who is a Jesuit, become Pope then? And so the thing we must understand is that Pope Francis did not seek out the office. You notice the phrasing there is you're promising not to seek out high office. And Pope Francis didn't seek out this position. In fact, he didn't want it. And he tried to avoid it. And he has been very open and vocal about the fact he did not want to be Pope. For example, in his address to students, he said, "No, I did not want to be Pope. Is that okay?" So he was very, very clear. He didn't want that title. He didn't want that position, that calling. And he tried to avoid it. You say, well, how did he try to avoid it? Well, think about when Pope St. John Paul II, when he died, you had the conclave, and Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger is the one who got the most votes and became Pope Benedict XVI. But guess who was the guy who got the next highest amount of votes? Yes. So he knew that if something happened to Pope Benedict XVI, he died, or whatever, there was a really good chance that he could be the next one in the next conclave. And so he tries to maneuver. So when he turned 75, as soon as he turned 75, he turned in his letter of resignation as Archbishop. And he thought, okay, I've resigned as Archbishop. I'm 75 years old. I'm safe because I've resigned and I'm too old. So I'm in the clear, is sort of what he was hoping. Obviously, that didn't help because he was elected Pope anyway. But I just want you to see that he was attempting to try not to be. So he wasn't seeking out high office. He was trying to avoid it. So he was very much within his Jesuit formation in the way that he acted. Now the question is, well, why did he accept it then? And one of the things that really helped him to accept the position was a statement by Pope St. John Paul II. And this is what St. John Paul II had written. I also ask the one who is elected not to refuse, for fear of its weight, the office to which he has been called, but to submit humbly to the design of the divine will. God, who imposes the burden, will sustain him with his hand so that he will be able to bear it. In conferring the heavy task upon him, God will also help him to accomplish it. And in giving him the dignity, he will grant him the strength not to be overwhelmed by the weight of his office. So this is why Pope Francis accepted, because Pope John Paul II said, if one is elected, don't refuse. Understand it as the will of God. Embrace that, knowing that God will give you what you need to live out that calling. And so this is why he accepted. Now, once he accepted, it became very apparent quickly that he was not going to be he was going to be a unique pope. Let's just put it that way. So when he emerges dressed as Pope for the first time, he's in all white. And the cardinals are astonished because he's wearing his usual cross. He turned down wearing the gold papal pectoral cross that popes wear, and he just kept the cross that he'd been wearing and the ring that he had been wearing. He also refused to put on the red mozzetta, the little red sort of cape-looking vestment that his predecessors had worn the first time they were introduced as Pope, and he refused that. So he's just in white, he's wearing the same cross, the same ring, and so this is sort of already, he's kind of going against the grain. He's different. I'm not going to be like everyone else, right? I'm not going to be like everyone before me in those ways. He also refused to take off his black orthopedic shoes. He was not going to wear the red expensive shoes. He was going to keep his black orthopedic shoes on. And that's what he did. So again, we see him there being very unique. But here's where it gets even more interesting. So when he's presented to the public for the first time as Pope, and it's typical that the Pope bless the people. But Pope Francis sort of turns the table. And here's what Pope Francis asked as he's, being presented as the new Pope. He says this, and now I would like to give you a blessing, but first I want to ask you for a favor. Before the bishop blesses the people, I ask you to pray to the Lord to bless me. A prayer by the people asking for a blessing for their bishop. Let us say this prayer in silence, your prayer for me. So before he blesses the people, he asks the people to pray that he would be blessed. And that very much endeared him to the people. And of course, he prayed his blessing upon them. And you notice that he refers to himself as bishop. Again, we talked about how he's not really into titles and all that sort of thing. And so, while it's true that the Pope is the Bishop of Rome and he is a bishop, he's so much more. But yet he refers to himself as the bishop. So I think that's important to know. In terms of reformer, just running really fast so that I don't keep you too long. He chose the name Francis intentionally because he wanted it to be clear that the things that he was going to emphasize in his papacy were some of the same things that St. Francis of Assisi emphasized. And so he, in some ways, is basically announcing, by taking that name, he's announcing, I'm coming to rebuild the church, just like St. Francis of Assisi was called to do. And so some similar emphases there. One, criticizing the luxuries of the church. Two, care for the poor and the outcast. Very much significant parts of his papacy and very much significant parts of St. Francis of Assisi and his calling to rebuild the church. In terms of his understanding of the church, he sees the church more as a field hospital than a museum or a concert hall. So think about those images. A field hospital is, it's in the field. It's out in where war is going on, and that's where you're taking care of the wounded, right? I mean, there's the battle going on, and you have the field hospital to take the wounded and to try to treat them while the battle is going on. That's how he sees the church. He doesn't see the church as a museum. Well, what's wrong with a museum? Well, when you go to a museum, you're looking at and you're thinking about just what was, and you're admiring what was. But again, that's sort of that stuck in the past kind of mentality. Not that there's anything wrong with museums. I love museums, but he's saying the church isn't called to be a museum. Is basically the point. In a concert hall, what do you do where do you go to a concert hall for? To be entertained, to go for the show. And so he's saying, look, the church isn't a museum. The church isn't a concert hall for you to be entertained. We're a field hospital. And we got wounded all around us. And we need to be tending to the wounded. And so that is a significant part of his ecclesiology. He does identify very much with the poor and marginalized people of the world. Even as early as 1960, this was something very much that was a part of his heart. He talks about when he was teaching children, and he said he wrote this letter to his sister, and he says, I teach religion. The little boys and girls are very poor. Some of them come to school barefoot. Often they have nothing to eat, and in the winter they feel the cold in all its harshness. You don't know what this means because you have never missed something to eat. And when you feel cold, you just sit near the stove. I'm telling you this to make you think. While you are content, there are many children who are crying. While you are eating, many of them have nothing but a piece of bread. And when it's raining and cold, many of them are living in tin shacks, and sometimes they have nothing to cover themselves with. Kind of puts things in perspective there, doesn't it? When you think about that reality, the reality that many of us experience versus the reality that perhaps others is a harsher reality in many ways. So you see that love and care for the poor and the marginalized people of the world as being part of his understanding of what the church is here for and who we are called to look after. He's also very much concerned with environmental issues. And so he's stated all of us are called to watch over and protect the fragile world in which we live. And so he believes very strongly in that, that we have been given the stewardship over creation, and therefore we have a responsibility to care for it. And then finally, he's sort of known for this idea of bridges, not walls. Bridges, not walls. And so he's reflecting on his Catholic experience as a child, and this is what he says it was like when he was growing up as a kid and growing up as a Catholic. He says, I remember that when I was a child in Catholic families like mine, you could hear them say, no, we can't go visit them because they weren't married in church. They were excluded, and we really couldn't go. It was the same thing if they were socialist or atheists. Now, thank God, we don't say that anymore. It was a kind of defense of the faith, but with walls. However, the Lord has built bridges. So think about what he's saying there. He's saying, we don't have to isolate ourselves behind walls and hide out from the world. We can engage people and treat people like people, regardless of what their philosophy is, regardless of what their religion is, regardless of what their lifestyle's like. We can still build bridges to them and reach out to them and love them, care for them, and be those witnesses. And so we can either be hunkered down behind our walls, build them up, and feel good and nice and secure, or we can build those bridges and cross over them and connect with other people. Now, he's not saying that means that, you have to embrace socialism or atheism to build the bridge, right? That's not what he's saying in that statement, but he's saying, it was just this faith of exclusion. These people are excluded. Stay away from those people. They might contaminate you, right? They might lead you astray or something like that. And so that's very much this idea of bridges and not walls. And so to sort of sum up about him and then just give a few details of the class, and then we'll be finished for tonight. Like I said, he is difficult to categorize as Pope. There are some people that think he's too conservative, and then there's some people who think that he's too liberal. Some people think he's too radical, and some think that he's not radical enough. Michael Gerson, who wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post, put it this way, speaking about Pope Francis, says, sometimes he sounds like a Latin American lefty calling for social justice and criticizing selfish profit. Sometimes he is defiantly unmodern on matters sexual. The US media have struggled to find and apply a simple ideological label. So it's just, we love labels, right? If we can label somebody, we can dismiss them. So whatever sort of ideology you associate yourself with, if you label someone else as the opposing ideology, you can say, I can dismiss them because they're that group, right? And so what they're saying is difficult about Pope Francis is it's hard to categorize him because he doesn't fit neatly into categories, because the very moment you think that you can label him as this, he says something that makes those people mad, and he's obviously not fitting in with them. And so then people will think, well, maybe he's over in this camp. And the very moment you think that he's in this camp, he does something or says something that makes them mad. And it's like, well, he's apparently not in that camp. And remember, I said he's very methodical. He doesn't do anything without thinking about it. So what does this mean? Well, part of it, I think, is that Ignatian harmony, that Ignatian synthesis. He's trying to bring unity instead of being polarized and fragmented. So I think that's part of what he was doing. But I also think that in some sense, he's challenging everybody. He's challenging every group. He's saying that, there's something wrong with every group. There's something wrong with every ideology out there. And so where that's wrong, I'm going to call it. Where that's wrong, I'm going to disagree with it. But that doesn't mean I'm going to cast you aside and say you don't matter. But he sort of seems to be challenging everybody at times, and so people don't quite know what to do with them. And so you have people who, one moment they love them, and the next minute they can't stand them. Right? And so just to let you know that this is part of the man, and he's trying to achieve that unity, and he's trying to do so dealing with these opposing kinds of groups and ideas and beliefs and convictions. So that's a lot about Pope Francis, but we always talk about the Pope who wrote the writing before we explore the writing, because I think it's important to know about the author before you read their writing, because it gives you some sense of how they're thinking, why they think the way they think, why they say the things that they do. So this is why we always do in the first session is about the author, and then the rest of the session we move on. So in preparation for next week, a quote from the very first section of Rejoice and Be Glad. He says, the Lord wants us to be saints and not settle for a bland and mediocre existence. And so this writing, Rejoice and Be Glad, is about practical holiness, is really what it's about. And so he's going to approach holiness in a very practical way, and this sort of sets that up. You're called to be a saint. You're not called to settle. And there's lots of people who just say, well, I'll just settle for, saint seems too far out there. So I'll just settle. And he's saying, no, we're called to more than that. So my hopes for this class and the way that things will go in terms of an outline. So we've all obviously finished tonight's session. So we have 7 more sessions, and we'll take a chapter each week, and you'll read that ahead of time, and then I'll talk about it, and then of course afterwards we'll take questions and comments and things like that. You'll notice that I left July 29th. I left it blank because that is the date for the pilgrimage to Guatemala. And so we want those who are going to Guatemala to be fully engaged in the pilgrimage and not have to worry about, hey, I missed a class, or I need to zoom in or whatever. So we've left space in the schedule for that. So we either won't meet for the 29th, or if we meet, it'll just be to get together and maybe have a discussion over the sections that we've already covered or something like that. But as you can see, we'll be finished. Our last session will be August 26th. In terms of how you can get a copy of this writing, there's several ways. So if you are a volunteer lifeguard at Gold, we've ordered some copies. They're on their way, some hard copies. They should be here in a day or two. And so we'll have those available for you if you want. For others, you can find copies on Amazon.com at a reasonable price and get them pretty quickly. And so the two that I recommend, so there's the one on the top. This is published by the USCCB. So obviously it's trustworthy. It's by the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops. And then this one is published by Pauline Books and Media, and it's a very reliable translation as well. This one's a little cheaper, but this one's a little bit bigger print, I think. So, you know, you can choose there if you're ordering. Also, if you don't want to buy a copy, you can just go online to the Vatican website, and you can read the document for free. So it's available for free as well. And so that being said, I'm going to, I'm going to stop recording.